Good morning, and thank you so much for keeping it K24. We'd like to welcome you to our social hour. Shiko Kaitani here with you. What a glorious Wednesday it is. Asante Sana for keeping us company and for the feedback that we continue to receive through our social media platforms. What a pleasure at K24 TV on Instagram, Facebook, X as well. I always like to hype up our WhatsApp number that's at the bottom of your screen. It's scrolling. There you go. If you want to contribute, if you'd like to send in those comments or even questions, we would like to welcome you very, very much. This time around, we are actually focusing on investing in our food security. Today, as you know, major and connected global challenges threaten the sustainability of food, with the most vulnerable people and communities at greatest risk. So the question here is, what is the science telling us? That there are, and there is hope, there are sustainable food systems that can save people and save our planet. In fact, the push to increase the nutrient content in our staple foods is on. And my guest today will be telling us all about the process, including a very exciting science week that will be bringing brilliant minds and policy makers together so we can actually see these solutions come to life. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Susan Moenga. She is a Genomics and Bioinformatics Scientist. I know you're like, what is it? What? She will tell you what all that means, okay? But Dr. Susan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me this morning.
Karibu sana. I don't think I have ever had the pleasure of interviewing or engaging with someone in your field. So for our viewers' sake, explain those terms, those titles.
I actually have a feeling that you have.
Oh, yes?
They may not have introduced themselves that way.
Yeah.
But there's not too few of us, right? So I'm a plant scientist, in general terms, and that means that I spend a lot of time thinking about how to utilize the information that we have about crops, about plants generally, to improve our crop systems. My work as a genomics scientist, it's to look at the genome. So DNA is the blueprint of life for all the life forms that exist, and decode the information that comes out of that to try and understand what controls a certain trait, and especially if that trait is of interest, say it has to do with yield. You know, so what genetic component across the whole genome actually gives rise to that particular trait, and how can we utilize that information to reach that trait.
Wow, so for you, science is everything. It's the solutions to what we are going through right now.
Yes, but that also exists within a lot of context, right? So science does not exist in a vacuum. There's a lot of policy that enables activities around science, prioritization in terms of technology that we use in science as well.
Okay. You know, we want to start off by kind of discussing the state of food security on this continent, because it's not just Kenya that we're focusing on. Let's think big, right? What would you actually categorize as the threat to food sustainability, our land, water systems? What is threatening that?
So many things. The continent is quite unique within that context. And largely, a lot of the things that have made us as a people more vulnerable to food insecurity actually stem from low investments in agriculture. Low investments within the entire value chain, from research and development, within the actual, agriculture system in our individual countries. If, for example, we were to focus in Kenya, within, specific counties, as well as the downstream sort of value chain. What that means is that we do not necessarily have tools to respond to, say, climate shocks. So while climate change is a major, contributor to food insecurity, if we had more investments in agriculture, we would be slightly better equipped, perhaps, to handle those shocks when they do land. But like I said, Africa is very unique. We have a major land degradation problem. Our soils across most of the arable part of Africa, I'm sorry, I've got a cold, has what we call largely unresponsive soils. These are marginal soils. That means that even when we work very hard to ameliorate with inputs, it doesn't necessarily output the expected, outcomes with those interventions. And to change those kinds of dynamics, like I said, you've got to have very concerted efforts that recognizes the problem and perhaps dedicates a significant chunk of money every year for a certain period to try and tackle that problem. We've got a major biodiversity loss. That's due to many reasons. I mean, we are urbanizing very quickly. Economic growth with urbanization and perhaps slightly reduced interest by, say, young people as they go along in building their careers. That also means that a number of crops that perhaps we could grow to allow for us, whenever, for example, there's a disease for that's specific to maize, that we have other crops that are growing.
There's alternatives, right? But
that can
now
protect us from those, right? And so when you got that the significant amount of biodiversity loss, as I mentioned, it makes us even more vulnerable again to other shocks, climate or otherwise.
I think this morning, Dr. Suda is actually going to highlight the importance of this particular conversation and why we should care. How does this actually relate to you? Because it's all about what's on your plate at the end of the day. So when we talk about, as she's talking about the whole chain, okay, where does it begin from what's literally actually creating barriers to our food security? It's important to understand the entire process. But this is where the science comes in, because when we talk about innovation and biofortification, it means those are the solutions that we want to highlight. So what is biofortification, and just how do you believe this is the solution to the food security challenge on the continent?
Biofortification is largely works within the context of recognizing that a lot of the staples that we consume today don't actually have the full nutritional composition that would lead to healthy diets, robust diets. And so then it's working towards increasing the density of those nutrients that are otherwise would be lacking within those staples via breeding, and this breeding can be by different mechanisms. It could be conventional, so this is how we've done breeding for the longest time. You take a crop that's possibly high in a certain nutrient, and you cross it with another crop that doesn't have a similar nutritional profile, and progressively then you can work towards increasing that particular target nutrient. And this can also be done by other biotechnological means. So this is genetic modification or gene editing or genome editing, etc. We've also, at least within the African context and perhaps even outside Africa, fortification of foods has also been done from an industrial approach. So going downstream, for example, your maize flour. When you go to the supermarket, you see pembe that's fortified. And so this has, added vitamins, added maybe proteins.
And all this is being done on manufacturing
level. This is
on
on the processing side of things.
That's interesting, because when we are picking something off the shelf, you see that label, but you don't understand what it means.
What does it actually mean?
So so what they're doing is adding that nutritional value.
Correct. So they're adding this this extra component. So there'd be chemicals that are food grade that are also tested to be available to the human body after you've consumed it. So
what exactly is the challenge that you would say scientists are facing in pretty much enhancing this conversation, promoting, creating awareness about biofortification? Because if this is really the way to go, why are we not seeing this just being every day,
Right. So I would take that from a second part of the question that you asked me earlier that I didn't actually address, how this biofortification contributes to food security. So food security has many layers. It's not just the sufficiency or access to sufficient food, it's also access to healthy food. Right? And that's really the biofortification where it comes in. And the challenge with being able to communicate this message is that it is what we call that deficit in nutritional composition is something we call hidden hunger. So it's not something that people are very familiar with. As you eat on your regular diets, you're not aware that perhaps your ugali doesn't have the nutritional composition that it should have. Or when you eat the same type of food consistently for a whole month, for a whole quarter, for a whole year, even though you have your portion of protein and vitamins from your vegetables as well as your starches from, say, maize, you end up having a very prescribed composition in terms of the food that you're taking. And if those foods that you're regularly taking are deficient in one or two, you'll consistently be lacking, those particular nutrients. And so we're looking at, potentially a chronic
illness
issue, around these things. And unlike food shortage, where well, I slept hungry last night, I didn't have enough food, or I only can afford one meal. Nutritional deficiency, the impacts of nutritional deficiency are not immediately apparent, right? And so often we worry about the general health of the population, starting from children. Starting from when women are pregnant, so that they have access to sufficient iron, which is important for your blood makeup, your immune system, and so many other aspects of your healthy body. And so when you don't have that supply, and you don't have it consistently, the children that come out of that, the children that, at school going age, often have certain characteristics that imply that perhaps that they have this sort of chronic deficiencies. However, unless they actually do fall sick, there are no immediate interventions, right? Because it's not that you fell down, you fainted because you were hungry, right? And by the time the symptoms become apparent, it's often too late. And now when you look at it collectively as a whole population, can you really have a healthy population when people are not having, a sufficient supply of these nutrients in their diet?
That's a scary thought.
It is
because
very scary.
When you talk about, and I like that term because it kind of just gives us that shock value that people are going through hidden hunger. You look fine, you seem fine, but you're lacking the nutrients to keep your body functioning at its optimum level. Then you start to see all these diseases coming up. It's interesting because just a week or two ago, I was, engaging the Chronic Disease Society of Kenya. And if you see the list of chronic diseases that are out there, again, when we trace it back, it's about what are people consuming as part of it. Of course, there's all that predisposition about genes and all that, but literally lifestyle. So here we have these solutions that are coming in from the onset, not at the manufacturing or the processing level. The thing here is, okay, fine, we get it, these are the solutions, but how do we tackle a number of things, Dr. Susan? For example, the cost factor. When we see how much brain power is going into all of this, does this mean at the end of the day, when we start embracing things like biofortification, we're going to start seeing an increase in terms of price for food going forward? Because I mean, someone's got to pay Dr. Susan.
I wish that's how it works. I'd be very happy to see my salary scale up. Well, yes and no. When government policy, when the right government policy framework exists, it really should protect the consumer. And I think you'll find that the Kenyan government is particularly quite aware of this hidden hunger problem. And so we've had policies in place since 2012, 2015 about flour blending, for example, to ensure that even as, while it might be difficult to actually change people's diets, that by regulating the kind of products that actually reach the consumer, that you do provide these resources in those foods. Now, when a lot of scientific input has gone into developing a product, generally there's that fear, and that really is a very legitimate concern, there's that fear that then the price point, you know, of course, will go up. However, when you think about the economies of scale, right, if we recognize that this is collectively a huge problem, when you look at minerals like zinc, where we've got like 80% of the population that's, you know, deficient in this, then, you know, we have concerted efforts towards this, and this is being led by the government. So researchers at the Kenya Agricultural and Livestock Research Organizations will be spearheading this kind of work. So varieties that are coming out of that pipeline are already developed by the public, because these are, you know, taxpayer investments, right? And so finally, when you've got these varieties very commonly available to farmers and being very commonly grown, and they're high in zinc, they're high in vitamin A, they're high in proteins, then there is no premium to growing, you know, that particular variety, because it becomes the common practice to do it. The immediate intervention might seem costly. It'll take time. There might be industry investments that, you know, that lead to those outcomes. But in the long term, I believe that it won't cost at a premium.
Okay. Let's allow our viewers, you know, to send in their questions. And here's just a quick reminder, dear viewer, that, by the way, you can throw in your questions to Dr. Susan this morning through our WhatsApp number that you can see at the bottom of your screen. Remember, our social media platforms are also pretty active, right? So that's at K24 TV on Instagram, Facebook, as well as Twitter. Speaking of which, we always like to tease our topics prior to actually coming live on the show, just to give people the opportunity to start changyang, by the way, on our platforms. And so let's just take one, because I can already see there's one here that's from Oscar in Malindi, who says, "Hey Sheiks, napenda show yako sana." Thank you, Oscar. Who goes on to say, "Food security is a major concern in our society today, and I wonder why there is not as much talk about it." Now, I'm a part-time farmer, and would like to ask, how can we reduce the cost of healthy food, the marketing of unhealthy food, and improve food literacy to support better diet quality for all people? We tend to look at price first before anything. How interesting, and we're just talking about the cost factor. Okay, so what do you say to that?
Well, that's a multi-layered question.
I know.
And a really good one at that.
Yeah,
I'll start with the first bit. Why isn't there a lot more talk about it? I think there is. It's very siloed. So, you know, it's happening within certain sectors. So the people that are, you know, researching on this, it's always within this context. Food insecurity and nutritional insecurity. But these are, you know, they're scientists who meet at very high level conferences, you know, policy makers and decision makers, as the country is, you know, perhaps, you know, deciding on what its priorities going forward within that sector. And it's not apparent to the public that these are animatedly happening conversations. And I think, you know, he's absolutely right that we do need to have these questions and these conversations out in the public. It also signals the public that the government cares, the scientists, all the stakeholders, policymakers, globally, people care about this. And there's massive investments that are coming into tackling this issue. And when that is communicated to the public, I think that the farmer would be comforted to know that there are a lot of people that are trying to fix it from different sectors that finally converge at the farmer having the right varieties, at them having access to information about agronomic skills that they can put in place to try and move things forward. Now, please remind me about the rest of that question.
Promoting healthy food.
Right. And marketing and
promoting healthy food, and, you know, how do we kill unhealthy food? Right.
I think one of the things I said earlier is that the hidden hunger is not immediately apparent, and so people don't feel that it's something that they need to respond to very quickly or urgently. one of the things that we could do, perhaps as as scientists and other players in industry, is to talk about it a bit more.
Correct, yeah.
And in that way, by raising that awareness, then people are very cognizant. And even when they go to the mama mboga, or they're going to the supermarket, or they're taking their kids out on a Sunday afternoon from church, they're making very informed decisions about what it is they're consuming.
Right.
Because they become very aware, right? It's always in the back of your mind.
Yeah.
Oh, well, this is a challenge, this is a problem. And it might not become apparent even with my children as I feed them. And so, as I decide in the morning, what's my diet for my family? There are healthy or healthful implications for choosing this versus that.
Correct.
So instead of the sausages, perhaps ndoma, twice a week might be a much better much better alternative. So I think it's really putting that buzz in the ear of Kenyans that there is a real problem. The numbers are staggering.
Yeah.
The impact at an individual level, cognitively, physically, now and in the future, really it's so staggering.
It is.
And I like to think about this in the context of again, just the uniqueness of the African continent. The quintessential Kenyan is a 19-year-old person, right? Like 19, they haven't even gone to the workforce, right?
Right.
They're just beginning to imagine what their lives are going to be like. They've got to be very aware of the global dynamics, what works, what doesn't, where do they really, what's their purpose. They have to be physically capable of being robust in the workforce, right?
Yeah.
And they cannot do that
because
while
of
eating, unhealthy diets. And that's in the whole scale, right? The very downstream, very bad ones, or, a deficiency in multiple components that would otherwise be useful. Yeah.
Well said, Dr. Susan. I think for me, this is just such a huge learning curve, because it challenges each and every one of us, if you think about it, because it boils down to what you're feeding your family, and why we should ultimately care about some of the innovations and some of the suggestions, recommendations, let me put it that way, that scientists are actually giving us today. So what's your take on this particular discussion? We've sampled one text message. We hope there'll be many more when we get back as we engage Dr. Susan this morning. We're going to be asking her questions, obviously, around the safety factor of biofortified food, fortification food. And obviously, when we talk about issues to do with the GMO factor, where does that come in? There's a lot of speculation when it comes to biofortification, or biofortified foods, rather. So go ahead and also keep sending in those questions through our platforms. We'll see what we can do after the short commercial break.
1, 2, 3.
Oh, okay. There, it's okay. It's okay. And welcome back to our social hour with me, Shiko Kaitani, as we tackle food security on this Wednesday morning. It's all about innovation and biofortification, and we are talking about sustainable food systems today to deal with the ongoing challenge, by the way, of food security. One of the things that my panelist has actually highlighted is that we have a challenge of hidden hunger. Not so much so that there is no access to food. The question is, how nutritious is the food that you're eating? So we're taking it a step back, taking it all the way from the top and asking, what can we do throughout the chain, beginning with how it's produced? And scientists are working hard at this, believe you me. They are bringing all the best minds together, and in fact there is an upcoming conference, or can I just say a week-long event that will be coming up. There's a science week that we want to tell you about. In fact, my guest today is the definition of beauty and brains. Okay, she's a genomics and bioinformatics scientist. I'm talking about Dr. Susan Moenga, who's here with us in studio. Welcome back, Dr. Susan.
Thank you.
I'm kind of curious, by the way, how did this title kind of work out for you when you were in the dating pool? Now you're married, so it doesn't matter. How intimidating were you to these men who say, you women are just so empowered today? So you're like, yeah, hi, I'm a scientist.
No, well, if you want to fend off some characters. It's a very nice shield, I suppose.
I know, right? You're like, bro, you don't have the brains. Yeah. You don't have the brains to keep up with me. Yeah.
No, I think with the right specimen, it doesn't even come up, right?
Really?
Yeah, because then you have very exciting conversations.
I like that.
Yeah.
See the way you're such a scientist with the right specimen. That's
I'm
the
so
new
sorry
term for men. You specimens out there.
Human beings are specimens.
Joanne, aka my director, Kasavuli, tell all the men in the gallery that they are specimens.
Apologies.
Okay, let's get back to our conversation, Dr. Susan. That was a nice breather. We were talking about, obviously, sustainable food systems, but the question that a lot of people have, or the concerns, is how safe is biofortified foods?
Right.
And then also, we've always been hearing about genetically modified organisms, GMO, and people asking, okay, does biofortified mean that it's modified? What, I mean, where's the line?
Right.
Yeah.
So I'll answer the first part of that question by talking about one of the most successful biofortification efforts.
Yeah.
This is the orange fleshed potato. And I think this has been around since about 2009. And the breeding was done conventionally, like I mentioned, so identifying, the varieties that have, certain characteristics, and then of course being able to either to cross or to develop that characteristic in varieties of farmers and consumers like.
Yeah.
Now, that orange fleshness is because of the presence of something we call beta-carotene, which is a very important intermediate for the production of vitamin A. The reason why you can see well, we can have a robust immune system. Now, because this is bred conventionally, the assumption is, and often it's not just an assumption, these tests are done.
Yeah.
The assumption is that it is very similar on every aspect, apart from that particular trait, to the other varieties that don't have that particular trait.
Yeah.
And if there's any concern, there will be data to show that in fact, it's not a threat to other crop species that are growing adjacent to it or within the same land systems. It is not a threat to the rest of the ecosystem, birds and insects and humans as well. Now, we do not have, so genetic modification is one breeding tool for trait improvement in crops and animals as well. Now, it's not the only tool. Like I said, conventional breeding is really the most common. It's very labor intensive. It takes a long time.
Right.
So being able to run these trials, going through, the parents that you've identified that are meaningful in your crossing scheme, going through seasons of raising their babies and the babies of that.
Correct.
And then selecting and testing that they do actually have
it takes
that particular trait. And that the trait is actually stable, right? That when you grow it in, say that your primary tests were done in Busia. When you grow it in Makueni, do you still see the same trait? Or do you lose it because there's an environmental component?
Wow, all that is different findings.
Correct. And so that stability, and then year to year, do you still, recover that trait of interest? So it takes a long time. Variety development on average would take between 10 to 15 years before it hits precisely. And so there's a great appreciation for science. Genetic modification is it's an incredible tool because it shortens this pipeline by so many years, because by the time that you're, like I said, I'm a genomic scientist, so we study the genomes, just chunks of it, to try and understand what contributes to what codes for what protein, and where in the coding for those proteins is a regulation as well. If I were to modify this, does that actually change the state of the protein, the functionality of that protein? And so often, even as we are conventionally breeding, there are other people that are studying. It's not just that we see that trait, that there's a genetic component that controls that trait. So instead of working with the odds of being able to get that trait into a certain background, once you've identified that particular part of the genome that controls for that trait, you can go in and modify that bit to get to the trait that you want at a much shorter time scale. Now, the regulatory framework across the world varies significantly as to how we think we should utilize genetic modification as a breeding tool. So Kenya only recently, has revisited that and has signaled a positive sort of outlook in terms of policy regarding genetic modification. But in the past, for about 10 years, we had a moratorium around GMO, so we didn't really have any foods in our value chain that were genetically modified. But even just as conventional breeding, there are certain checkpoints that ensure that if indeed you do go the genetic modification route, that the product that finally reaches the farmer and the consumer is actually safe. And I assure you, the Kenyan government is so very capable. We've got a very robust biosafety authority that navigates the whole system from the time you start engaging. That you're running confined trials in the field. There's not an impact in the nearby fields as well.
Okay.
And eventually, when you finally have that product, how does it measure relative to the rest?
Yeah.
How does that compete within the ecosystem that it exists in?
So we got this. We
We absolutely have, I'm telling you.
Yeah.
And I think people really don't have a full understanding of how it's one of the most regulated processes
Right.
than, say, even the pharmaceutical industry. And I think it's because it's food.
It is food. I mean, that's,
food.
you're dealing with people.
It's the makeup of humanity,
It is, and it's very sensitive. So you can understand why the attention to detail is there. And we appreciate that. Let's look at one or two questions, Tafadhali, Joanne, and then we can actually throw that to Dr. Susan. As we continue with our conversation, we'll be hearing about that Science Week shortly. Linus from Kitengela, thank you so much for watching. You say, good morning, K24. Many farmers have always been hesitant to change their traditional ways of farming to incorporate new innovations. How can they be incentivized to produce food in a sustainable way? Okay. And then we've got Onesimus from Kitui who says, one thing we lack is data. How can we identify or map out these areas that have serious food insecurity? Perhaps the solution your panelist brings should be concentrated in such areas, families, communities, and eventually the continent of Africa. Thanks for the show. All right, so you've got two things here. Getting farmers to embrace.
Right.
So you guys as scientists have your work cut out for you. I don't know what barazas will have to be held, because when you're talking about the ones who are growing these staple foods that the entire nation depends on, how do you get them to adjust their thinking and how they are operating? Number two, if we talk about this hidden hunger, or we talk about okay, for him, he's talking about the issue of scarcity, but are there specific regions that this essentially should be geared towards?
Right. So the first question, I'll give that within a certain context. So I work for an organization called the International Crops Research Institute for the semi-arid tropics.
Okay.
It's a mouthful, I know. Or ICRISAT in short.
Yeah.
And ICRISAT is part of a much larger consortia called the CJR. And this consortia really, its focus is agriculture.
Yeah.
And just the nexus of agriculture with all other aspects of it, climate change and water, landscapes and such systems, etc. Now, ICRISAT has a certain mandate, a compendium of crops that fall within its mandate. And these are largely millets and a selection of pulses. So millets are the smaller grains. I hope majority of Kenyans will recognize finger millet, for example, what we make uji, wimbi.
Yeah, with,
And then we have pearl millet, which is commonly, grown in Eastern Kenya, for example, and in Western Africa, this is a commonplace kind of cereal. And then we've got sorghum as well. And for pulses, we've got pigeon pea, mbaazi in Swahili, chickpea, and groundnuts. Now, these crops, so if I were to talk about the pulses, for example, they're these really cool legumes that have the capacity to make their own nutrition in the soil. They make their own food in the soil.
Oh, nice.
And so when you grow them, they're able to establish a mutualistic association with microbes that live there, where they supply these microbes with food in form of carbon, and they get nitrogen in a form that a plant can access. So it's a bit of a handshake that allows for them to really thrive, even when they have very little input.
Okay.
Right? It's fascinating, and beans have the same capacity as well.
So it's
now, the millets that we also work with are what we call extremely hardy crops. So they don't require a lot of farm inputs. They have, a number of them have originated from the continent. So they're very well adapted to the agroecology here.
Okay, great.
Which is largely that there's no amelioration by irrigation, for example. They can do very well even under dry conditions.
That's good, And
they don't need a lot of farm inputs like fertilizer. Well, so when a farmer is growing a typical, say, maize or rice or wheat or whatever it is, and say, 2 years ago we had a major drought, so the biggest drought we've had in almost 40 years. What happens is that if this farmer was not climate proofing by irrigating, they almost suddenly lost their crop. But if they were also growing, maybe somewhere in the farm, they were also growing finger millet, they almost suddenly had yield, even in those conditions.
Okay.
And so as a baseline, you know, even just as a farmer knowing that, look, I'm farming both for my household as well as surplus to be able to raise money for my livelihood. How do I make sure, regardless of what happens within the climate aspect, that I can still have something?
Yes.
So we will highly advocate for this millets.
Okay.
And we do.
Yeah.
I think it's been difficult up until perhaps, you know, recently, to incentivize farmers to shift entirely to millets, because you have to have an assured market.
This is the thing. So when there's no market linkage, it's hard to convince them.
It's very difficult.
Okay.
It's very difficult. However, I think generally there's a lot of signal that the market is shifting. Yeah. And because there's increased investments. There are a lot of partners that are coming in and saying, look, last year was the year of millets, the very first one. The UN recognized this as the year of millets. And those are important signals that are telling farmers, you know, all the players, all the stakeholders in the industry that we are focusing on this. This is important, and it's particularly important for this continent. Okay. And with sufficient investments across the whole value chain, then those linkages are not as fragmented or non-existent. Farmers can have direct access to markets.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for the questions that came through. Dr. Susan, there's an exciting week coming up. You've got the Science Week that is set to be happening early next month, if I'm not wrong, right? So tell us or explain to us the objective of bringing leading scientists and policymakers together, and what exactly is to be discovered at this week-long event.
So we'll be having the CJR Science Week from the 1st to the 5th of July. Here in Nairobi, it'll be at the UN complex. Okay. And perhaps just to explain CJR, like I said, I work for ICRISAT, which is a member of this consortia of about 12 organizations with a lot of partners, including our national research centers across the world, not just in Africa, that have been over the last 50 years working within the context of agriculture, land systems, food systems, sustainability, climate change, and the policy framework for different country contexts in the world. Yeah. So the CJR came into being to kind of stand in the gap as countries were evolving. So for example, in Africa, a lot of us were just beginning to self-govern. And so we were just beginning to build our own research infrastructure within this agriculture framework. And so as you can imagine, there's a lot of knowledge that's been gained in working within this context. And then of course, working very closely with governments and being able to co-prioritize, you know, what's important within those contexts. Right. So all this knowledge that's been gained in the different sectors, we've got research centers that are focused on tropical research and tropical crop research, in livestock research. ILRI is right here in Utheru, that's one of them. We've got ICRA for the World Agroforestry Center, that thinks about agroforestry or mixed farming systems. As well, ICRISAT. We've got, CIMMIT, the World Fish and World Vegetable Center. There's a massive number of them. So all this knowledge that's been gained is, again, driven within that context of with all this very critical issues coming into agriculture. Do we have tools? Do we have solutions? We have prospective solutions that perhaps we've learned over the years that we can share, we can exchange notes about what's worked elsewhere, what could work here, and how do we get ready for the next 50 years? How do we feed people in the next 50 years? In Africa, how do you feed 2.5 billion people? That will be our reality in a very, very short time. And so really, it's to bring researchers, policymakers, science advocates, all the stakeholders, the public, into this sort of round table to talk about science.
I like how excited you're getting talking about this. It's like it's Christmas for scientists. So So very quickly, as we're saying goodbye, let me just combine the 2 points that I want to bring up next, which is number one, when people see conversations like this, they find it a very elitist kind of conversation. So first of all, it's, they think about, okay, that doesn't involve me, it's for other scientists. Right. Also, this is probably for farmers who are watching the show. But generally, why don't you emphasize why the public should actually care about sustainable food systems, Dr. Susan? And then also, let's try and understand what the positive impact of improved nutrition for communities, the nation, the continent means. What does it mean when we eat better and have access to the right kind of foods? So why should we care, and what happens if we start feeding people with the right food?
Oh, why should we care? We should absolutely care. Everybody should care about.
They're like, no, this is just for Ruto and his cabinet. Why should we care?
Especially Dr. William Ruto should care deeply about. Like we said earlier, food is intricately linked to a successful human enterprise. Our existence cannot be even relevant without food. Yeah. Right? And it's just the whole chunk of it. It's not just, the stuff that we do upstream. It's that, when you think about a country like ours, where a lot of our economic output is directly, not indirectly, directly linked to agriculture. It employs majority of Kenyans, rural or urban. And like now we're talking about healthful food systems. It's impossible not to care, and it would be reckless not to care. Yeah. We are the youngest, collectively as a continent, we are the youngest people in the world. We literally we hold the future of the world right in our palms. We have to be healthy to be able to move, the planet forward.
And to be productive.
Right. And so we absolutely have to care. We have to care. We have to be able to raise healthy children. We have to be able to sustain a healthy planet. Yeah. Right? That we're not taking too much out of it, without replacing the necessary components. Okay. And I cannot, and of course, there's a lot of, we spoke earlier at the very beginning about the impacts of climate change. A lot of things that are changing very quickly. We're experiencing, like I said, we came out of a drought and we've had extreme flooding. Yeah. And so there's every chance that the food as we know it today, access to the foods that we know today, might not be the case in a very short time. And those things can change very quickly. And so even when you have the capacity to buy, if there isn't food to buy, what does that mean? Right? And so we have to care about those things. And we should be asking questions. How is our government, how is our taxpayer money invested? And does it go to agriculture? Does significant amounts of it, enough amounts of it, actually go into agriculture? Correct. What policies are we putting in place to ensure that our children are healthy, our young women are healthy, our young men are healthy, that the future is actually promising? Okay. You had a second part to that question.
and you've actually answered it by saying, really, what happens when we're healthier? It simply means we need to have productive people. Absolutely. You cannot be a productive nation if people are sick. Absolutely. And are dealing with chronic disease 24/7. No, but last but not least, literally in 1 second, what more can we do to get young minds, more brain power, clever people like you, driving their efforts towards innovations around food security? What do you think we need to do, in these spaces, in these hubs?
So ICRISAT, as an example, developed a very high iron pearl millet. Yeah. And this is being deployed in parts of Western Africa. And one of the things that we've learned from that is that when you have innovations within a certain sector, is that it creates new, completely initially non-existent opportunities for the whole value chain. Nice. So there's opportunity to innovate, to really envision what does that actually look like. Okay. How do you get that seed to the farmer? How do you ensure that there's enough productivity, that we have enough reaching the farmer? Right. And consume aggregators, processing, and how do we ensure that that iron is actually still there even after processing? And then of course people downstream in the health spectrum, how do you also ensure that when people are consuming that they are actually getting that iron? Okay. So there's opportunity for a lot of young people to get involved across the whole, even just being able to talk about it within
I know,
the
there's
media
communications
like
around it.
Precisely,
Yeah,
very
okay.
powerful in getting the right points across.
All right.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Well said. Dr. Susan, this was a very insightful conversation. I appreciate you making time for us today. Want to wish you all the best, as well as the entire team and even the scientists who are gearing up for the inaugural Science Week that's coming up in early July. This is going to be big when it comes to the food and agriculture sector. And this being inaugural, it means, yes, this is the first and many, and hopefully many to come after this year's Science Week that will be coming up in July. So let's leave it there. We hope that we have been challenged to actually do more research more. You've been asked to participate. This is not just for the brainies and the geeks out there, tafadhali. It involves you too. So Dr. Susan, Moenga, and everybody within this space is inviting you to participate and also try to understand why it's important for us to continue with sustainable food systems for the greater good and for our future. Let's leave it there and of course hand over to our team from Interactive. The duo is in the house. Woo! Of Sarah and Tony. They're going to be taking a look at what's trending on social media. For me, Shiko Kaitani, thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful day up ahead. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.